right, it goes to the body, right, it goes to the aorta, move from those arteries to arterioles, right, to capillaries. That's where that gas exchange, the fusion is going to happen at capillaries. Moves to venules, to veins, and then to vena cava. We kind of talked about this in, I think, 181 or like a biology class. If you have questions on it, let me know. But I keep it really basic just because it's like, I'd rather we get to the nitty-gritty. One thing I did want to mention is how the blood gets returned back to the heart. I always thought this was like really cool. So if you all do a favor and take a big deep breath, like inhale, like, right? As you let it out, okay? So like it says here, when you inhale, right, your thoracic cavity, right, your rib cage, all that expands, okay? And because of that, we have built up a pressure, right? And so that pressure is actually going to force that blood upward. And so that is how we actually get blood from our lower extremities up. Gravity, right, thank you physics, drains that blood from our head and neck into our heart. But our lower extremities is actually our skeletal muscle. So there's usually skeletal muscle on either side of our veins that are, when they relax and contract, are actually going to push the blood flow up. Okay. And what we have here is also called valves. There are valves within the veins to prevent backflow. So it stops the blood from flowing back down, right? Because if we're contracting and we want to push the blood up towards our heart, we don't want to do all that work only to have it drop back out. So we have to have those valves that are going to close underneath to prevent blood from dropping back up, and then have them open up top. We know that when our ventricles contract, right, that pressure is what's going to push blood out. But it's always just, again, when we keep it kind of full circle, well, if it's pushed out, how do we bring it back? And so this is a couple ways in which we do it. Okay. All right. So, a couple things that we've talked about. So when you go to see a healthcare provider, right, and you get that nice, fun blood pressure cuff put on you, it's funny, I have white coat syndrome, so my blood pressure goes up when I'm at the doctor, which is hilarious to me. So there's a few things. So the first one is called systemic arterial blood pressure. What this means, this is literally just the blood pressure that they measure when they put the cuff over your arm. That cuff over your arm, we're going to talk a little bit more about in our in lab. It's going to go over what's called a brachial artery. And it's the systemic arterial blood pressure is a ratio of two numbers. So you know how you go to get your blood pressure. Hopefully you're at now less than 120 over 80. But that is what I mean by ratio. So yeah, it's now less than 120 and less than 180 is normal. Yeah, which is kind of weird. Yeah. Thank you, American Heart Association. Okay. So systolic, that first number, that top number, that is when the pressure that's in the heart, when our heart is contracting, and specifically when our ventricles are contracting. All right, so systolic tells us when ventricles contract, how much pressure is in the heart. Okay, that's going to help us push that blood out. Now diastolic is that lower number, and that's the lowest pressure that our ventricles have when they're relaxed. So, American Heart Association changed it. Normal used to be 120 over 80, right, you've heard that. But now the American Heart Association has said you need to be less than 120 for systolic. And I'm like, well, what's the cutoff? Like, you just said less than 120. I was like, but, so it should not, probably depending, I mean, this is for adults, I should say. So adults, like usually 18 and older, right? If the top number is below, like it should be about like 100 to 120. That's a little low. I'm like, wow. I have a friend of mine who's like resting heart rate. She's a runner though too. So like her resting heart rate is like 45, like anything low.
She's running.
Yeah, I was like, you were the reason why they changed this. Because her like normal blood pressure is like 106 over something, 105 over something. She's like the one, like I'm totally telling her story. But she went to the doctor the other day, and they took her blood pressure, and it was like 120, or it was like 118 over something, and they're like, oh, it's normal. She's like, no, that's high for me. And so it was just like she told me the story and like was like kind of laughing about it, but it's like for her that is high, which is funny because for the rest of us, well, that's where it should. So
if either one of them stays
Mhm. Yep, and it's not both of them. Whatever number is higher, that's a great question. Right, so let's say you have, your systolic pressure is 115, right, that's considered normal. But your diastolic, let's say, is 85. You are technically stage 1 hypertension. So you diagnose using the higher of the two numbers. So, just, okay. When we get to a hypertensive crisis, like you are at the hospital. Like this is borderline like stroke. If you have something that's higher than 180 or 120, like you need to get to the emergency room like yesterday. Like that is usually about the time, like you can tell your blood pressure is elevated, you know, like you have a headache, or you're starting to get like lightheaded or dizzy, right? Or your heart starts to race. But more if you now are hypertensive, stage 1, stage 2, that's when you're gonna start like I said, dizzy, severe headaches, you'll be disoriented, double vision, right, or blurry vision, chest pain, things like that.
So what about hypotension?
Hypotension, what do you mean, what about it?
Well, like what are the numbers, or like what's the threshold, I guess?
So it's gonna depend. Usually anything that is below, I'd say, like I said, about 100. And anything, I would say anything that is usually the cutoff for like less than, or the normal, I'd say between like 60. It's going to vary depending on like child, if you're a child obviously versus adult, but that's usually about like, I say you're 120 over 80, you're sitting pretty.
Question. Initial systolic pressure and diastolic pressure, so it doesn't depend on anything to do with the atrial?
Great question. Yep. So the reason why we measure the arterial blood pressure, because this is the pressure that's in the arteries after we pushed out that blood. And so that's caused by the amount of blood being injected out from the ventricles. Great question. So yes, the numbers when we measure is just ventricular pressure, not atrial pressure. Great question. Is diastolic. Yes. Yep. Okay, now we have pulse pressure and MAC. Okay, so pulse pressure is really the difference between your systolic and diastolic. We usually measure pulse pressure when we want to see how effective the heart is or if there's an issue with our heart. More often than not, we just take blood pressure, it's fine. But we really are checking to see, okay, like, where is the issue at, right? Like, how effective is our heart functioning right now? So we take our systolic, subtract it, right? The top number minus the bottom number should be between 40 and 60, right? Milliliters per mercury, or mmHg, right? Now, the other thing we have is MAP, or mean arterial pressure. Mean, I do not mean that that this pressure's a jerk, right? What I mean is it's the average, right? So the average arterial pressure, so the pressure in the arteries after we've gone a full cardiac cycle. So after we've gone full heart diastole, atrial contraction, right, and ventricular as well, right? We measure our mean arterial pressure by taking our diastolic pressure, which is dP, right? We're going to add that to pulse pressure divided by 3. What's it? So you don't have to memorize, so yes, knowing the different equations is important, like how it's measured, yes, I would know, but I'm not gonna give you a question on an exam, or we have to ask you to solve it, but I'm gonna ask you, like, how is it measured, right? Because conceptually it's important to understand, again, a computer's gonna make these calculations for you, but I want you to understand where these numbers are coming from, and how they're relating to one another. Okay, so yes, know the equations, not because I'm going to give you some numbers to solve, but so you can conceptually understand how we're pulling it together. Okay. Now, when we have high or low blood pressure, right, we need to find a way to regulate it. So there's a few different things that we do. These are all local control. Like a lot of these slides moving forward is just kind of memorization. Really no way around it. If we have like, the first one is metabolic autoregulation. What that means is that our blood vessels are gonna dilate automatically on their own if the blood flow is like too low. Alright, so our body does this on its own, part of the autonomic nervous system, right? It's gonna, those blood vessels are gonna open up if our body senses our blood pressure is too high, right? Or if our blood flow is too low, we're gonna just auto dilate, open up. If there is now a decrease or increase in blood flow, depending on what's going on, our body is going to release these chemicals. So vaso means a vessel, right? And so active, so these are either gonna open those vessels up or close them depending on what's being released, right? So vasodilation meaning it's gonna open the blood vessels. Constriction means it's gonna close them. So serotonin, histamines, bradykinins, prostaglandins are gonna do either one of those. Okay. Now, reactive hyperemia. So, if you all, we don't do this, but if you were to take your arm and you were to squeeze your hand, right, or squeeze your wrist, you don't have to, I don't want you to cough blood flow, and you relax and see how now it almost rushes where it's red. So what happens here is that you're gonna cut off blood supply to your hand, where I'm cutting off supply to my hand, right? And then so, because there's no blood flow going, as soon as I release, we're gonna have this overflow. So this like super high increase of blood rushing to that part that was just cut off, just to auto-regulate it. So it's reactive, meaning it's reacting because it's a response to being blood supply being cut off. And then emia just means perfusion or blood movement. So hyper just means more blood movement due to temporary cut off. I don't recommend going around like squeezing your arm cutting off blood flow, but it's just demonstration. Alright.
So, it's about the vasoactive chemicals. So all of those, they can either constrict or dilate. It's not like each one does something.
They're mostly are going to do one or the other depending on like what the situation is.
Should we use
Oh, just giving you some examples. Okay. And then angiogenesis. So genesis means new growth. Angio is like a vessel, so new growth of vessels. Right? Is that? But they also, one important thing to note is they're going to grow off of existing vessels. So they're not just going to like magically pop up on their own. They have to grow off of our existing vessels. Okay. So. Glad you're over with medulla in the brain, right? But absolutely not. So, medulla has what's called a vasomotor center. So vaso, again, we have the vessel motor telling us what to do with it. And so what it's going to tell, the medulla is going to tell us is that most vessels are going to constrict, but it's going to cause vessels in skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle to open, right? So, one thing important thing to note, the vasomotor center of the medulla is going to tell most blood vessels to close, right, or constrict, right, and then open skeletal and cardiac muscle, because we now have some issue where we need to open it up to get blood flow moving. Okay. So if you think about it, I was chaperoning camping a couple weeks ago, and it was like below freezing, like it was like horrible, it was so cold, right? And like my hands were ice cold, even though it was already packed, and like they were freezing, right, but my core was warm. So in that case, what's gonna happen, right, is like skeletal muscle is gonna constrict. That's why you tend to be very warm and your like where your fingers or your toes are cold, because we're gonna cut off circulation there because we need to keep our internal body temperature high, right? And so skeletal muscle, we're gonna dilate it because we need our skeletal muscle to contract. That's where the shivering comes from, right? But we also need to make sure that enough blood flow is going to like helping our heart rate and blood flowing to keep our vital organs going. Never. Okay. Now, the last thing is, so we have these things two things called baroreflexes and chemoreflexes. I'm going to talk about that next. just know that our heart rate also can be affected by sensory and emotional stimuli. So stressed, anxious, happy, excited, sad, whatever, is gonna affect our heart rate, right? Makes total sense. And then sensory. So right, so there's a loud noise in the hallway, and so you kind of jump out like me, and I'm like, what is going on? Right, my heart rate, if you look at my watch, just will jump. Okay. All right, so chemoreflex. Chemoreceptors are found in the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies, right? We'll learn about the aortic arch, subclavian arteries, and jurisdictional carotid next week in lab, so you'll get to see what I mean by those. But what I want you to know or to remember is that this is a response to changes in blood chemistry. So chemoreflex means blood chemistry, and specifically oxygen levels and carbon dioxide levels. So if we have hypoxemia, meaning low oxygen, or hypercapnia, meaning high carbon dioxide, right? It's going to stimulate those chemoreceptors and say, okay, we need to do something. So we're going to vasoconstrict, right? We're gonna slow down, close up our blood vessels to help us increase our blood pressure, which is then gonna push more blood to our lungs. So we have faster, more lung perfusion, meaning more blood flowing through the lungs to have gas exchange. So we can get rid of the high amount of carbon dioxide because we don't want it and bring in more oxygen. Sure. So when we have low oxygen or high carbon dioxide in our blood, I mean, they're both occurring at the same time, right? Low oxygen, high carbon dioxide. What our chemoreceptors are gonna do is activate that vasomotor center, right, in our medulla. Medulla is now gonna tell our blood vessels to constrict, close them down, increase blood pressure. If we increase our blood pressure, we're gonna push more blood to the lungs to allow for gas exchange. So more blood going to lungs, meaning more oxygen is being taken in and more carbon dioxide is being pushed out of our body. So chemoreflex occurs when hypoxemia, so low oxygen, hypercapnia, high carbon dioxide. Okay, now, baroreflex is a little bit different. It's not the same. Baro means pressure. Right? So pressure reflexes. So what happens, so you will find chemoreceptors and baroreceptors in the aortic arch and the aortic carotid sinuses. So they're going to be found in similar spots. But what happens is that it's going to detect changes in blood pressure. Baroreceptors detect changes in pressure. Okay? So if we have high blood pressure, it's going to automatically tell our body to vasodilate, right? We open up our vessels so we can drop our blood pressure and then lower heart rate. Okay? If our blood pressure is too high, that means our heart rate is too high. That can lead to stroke, that can lead to tissue death. That's just a whole slew of issues we don't want. But if these barodetectors detect too low blood pressure, right, what's going to happen is it's going to cause our blood vessels to vasoconstrict, right? So what that means is that we're going to need more pressure to push the same amount of blood through those vessels because now they're smaller, right? And so that's where we see this increase in blood pressure and then now increase in heart rate. So blood pressure and heart rate are are not one and the same, but they're the same. One goes up, so does the other. One goes down, so does the other. So baroreflexes are those baroreceptors, it's pressure. Chemoreflexes are chemicals, and that's oxygen and carbon dioxide. What questions y'all have for me? Besides, why is everybody up?
Yeah.
Very few percent. Okay, so let's say that our baroreceptors detect super high blood pressure, right? And so we want to bring it down. Our blood pressure is too high, and it's now we're hypertensive, so we're now like 120, 130, right? Very high. So two things are gonna happen. There's two hormones that can potentially be released, right? So we have epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is their adrenaline. So that's gonna open up that skeletal muscle and create muscle blood vessels. And it's going to do so acting on beta adrenergic receptors. So those, remember those beta adrenergic receptors from 201? No, cause I know, cause I'm talking, right? There, right. And then also too, the atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, so atrial natriuretic peptide. What that means, it's a peptide that basically forces sodium and water out, right? Because water follows salt. So the ANP or atrial natriuretic peptide is gonna force water out of force sodium out, and then so water follows. It's also gonna help with vasodilation. It's gonna open up our blood vessels. So, blood pressure too high, epinephrine and ANP are gonna be released.
Wouldn't epinephrine increase?
It can, but we normally give it but it's because it vasodilates. So it's gonna open up these blood vessels, so it's gonna drop our blood pressure. And so when we're in a sympathetic, not when we're in a parasympathetic.